All right, welcome back to On the Ball, the podcast series from the Vanderbilt Sports and Society Initiative. I'm Andrew Maraniss, and I am really excited to have Michael Fletcher, senior writer from ESPN, with us today. Michael, thank you so much for joining.
My pleasure, Andrew.
Now, you wrote a recent article that I read on ESPN.com on Harry Edwards, and a figure that really invented the field of sports sociology. Such an important figure. I think you wrote in the piece that uh, the strongest advocate for Black athletes in history, and I don't think there's a close second, really. Comes through in the article that Dr. Edwards is he's got cancer throughout his body right now, and I really read this article as a chance to give an important figure their flowers, while they're still with us. I know you're an investigative, serious reporter also, but in a sense, this was a tribute to a man in a way. And I wondered what was the impetus to write this article at this time?
I mean, I think you hit it right there, Andrew. There was a sense of wanting to sort of bring together all of Dr. Edwards' achievements into one piece. I think he's a name, for people who follow sports that they hear, but maybe don't fully understand the sort of the arc of his journey, right? He's a quote in a story, right? He's the guy you go to talk about the Kaepernick protest or some other kind of protest. But I think particularly now, like for young people particularly, I don't think they quite understood kind of like the contribution of Dr. Edwards. And I was trying to sort of bring that into focus, right? And sort of bring into focus the kind of peril that he faced for his activism. In this era we live in now, we're aggrieved if someone attacks us on social media, but Dr. Edwards lived with, people physically, coming after him and the kind of the kind of vitriol and the kind of anger that he stirred up. I think people don't understand. I mean, maybe they read it in history books, but this is a living figure that actually dealt with this stuff and stood strong in the face of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to get into a lot of that, but before that, I want to learn and give our listeners a chance to learn more about your backstory. I know you had written for the Washington Post for a couple of decades, not about sports, but what's your background in terms of why you got into journalism?
Yeah,
Where'd you grow up? What were the influences on your life that got you
I know.
started in this career?
It's funny. In many ways, I think I'm an accidental journalist. It's funny. I grew up in New York City, mainly in Queens, and and it's funny to say this, but one of the reasons I think I became a reporter is that I had a paper route as a kid. When
Okay.
I was like, I remember telling a fib, but I think you had to be 12 to have a paper route, and I was like 10, and I was a little tall for my age, so I applied for this paper route, just to make a few dollars because I remember wanting to buy a television so I could watch Yankee and Mets games, and isn't how she competing with your siblings, and my mother doesn't want the TV on in the living room. I wanted my own TV. I still remember this 59.99 for that little black and white, and
Wow.
so I got this paper out, and it got me sort of reading the paper. Like after I delivered the paper, I'd kind of look at it, but even as a kid, I never made the connection like between what I'm reading and someone actually writing these stories. But that was probably the first little germ of of an idea there. And then I remember being in junior high, and one of my favorite classes was social studies, and what we'd have a day for what we used to call current events, right? And we'd sort
Okay.
of talk about newspaper stories, and I always enjoyed that, right? It just felt like these people who wrote these articles were kind of in the mix, right? They were part of like they were witnesses to history and all of that. In that sense, I wouldn't have said it that way in junior high, but I think that's what I sensed. But I still didn't quite know what to do. So, fast forward, I go to high school, I then go to college. I thought I was going to be an engineer. I went to school, Brooklyn Tech. I was good in math. I
Okay.
thought I was good in math. But I realized I didn't have a passion for that and go to college. And I was kind of an undeclared major. And an admissions officer talked me into the School of Public Communication at Boston University, where I went. And then at BU, I ended up getting involved in a Black student newspaper and becoming, writing some stories for it and becoming one of the editors of the paper through the years. And that was the most fulfilling thing ever. There was something empowering about, writing a piece, and even for this little student paper, and you see it in the student union, you might see some students reading your article, and it just felt empowering. And also, being a journalist opened doors. You could go talk to the university president, you could talk
Hmm.
to the athletic director, you could talk to like some controversial professor, and it was just exciting. And I never looked back. I worked at the Baltimore Sun. After getting out of school, I grew up in New York, but ended up moving first to DC, to the Washington Star, then to Baltimore for the Baltimore Sun, then to the Post, as you pointed out. I was at the Post for over 2 decades before coming over to ESPN's The Undefeated, and then later moving over to kind of ESPN proper, if you will, and working for the Enterprise slash investigative unit. So it's been quite a journey. I've covered economics, the White House, education, and only late in life sports. I was a lifelong sports fan. As a kid, I played a lot of sports, but not like in a formal way. Never like on the high school team or anything like that. But we'd have summer leagues in the park, playing basketball. We played little league baseball. I did all these things, and I was always a big fan of sports. But I always stayed away from it for work because I didn't want fun to be work or work,
Yeah.
to intrude on my fun, however you want to put it. So, but ESPN has kind of given me an opportunity to write about sports, but not so much in a covering an event way, but in writing about important figures like Dr. Edwards and things that are kind of part of sports, but kind of the, if you will, the serious side of sports.
Okay.
Yeah.
And speaking of Dr. Edwards and your background, I'm not sure how old you are, but I mean, when did he enter your consciousness? Would you have been old enough in like 68 to have a sense of what was going on,
Yeah, I
or
had a sense of that,
much
but
later?
I didn't know Dr. Edwards. I probably didn't become aware of Dr. Edwards until, gosh, that's a good question. I would say probably during my journalism career. Sometime, I started working in journalism in 1979. So that's, just think about that for a second. But but it's been a minute. But somewhere in there, I couldn't tell you precisely when.
Yeah.
But I do remember the iconic protest, of course. I mean, for some reason, like the '68 Olympics, like just seared into my brain. I remember watching a lot of those events. And I remember, I mean, obviously not just the protest, but I remember Lee Evans, and I remember Jimmy Hines. Some of these athletes beaming, like these things, stick in your mind. Even George Foreman with the flag and all of that.
Hmm.
I remember, watching that. The Mexico City Olympics was the first one that I really took it. And it's probably one of the one I enjoyed the most. And I was 10 years old, I think, at the time. So
Yeah.
that was, but it did sort of make an impression on me. But I had no idea that Dr. Edwards was, say, behind the protests. John Carlos, Tommie
Right.
Smith. I had no idea. Yeah.
Okay. And then you mentioned you wrote for The Undefeated, which is the ESPN site now called Anscape, really studies race and sports and culture. When you were at Boston University, and I wrote a book about Perry Wallace, who was the first black basketball player in the SEC, and he encountered incredible racism in places like Starkville, Mississippi, and Tuscaloosa, Alabama. But he would say, like some other athletes have said, that Boston is where he felt most uncomfortable. Did you write about the connections between sports and race when you were a student at Boston University, or have any encounters with Bill Russell or any of the Boston athletes that were talking about that issue there?
Actually, no. I didn't do a lot of sports writing, even as a student journalist. But I experienced the racism of Boston. It's really interesting. I was at BU during the busing controversy there,
Okay.
which I think inflamed the city. And then little did I know, I'm going up to Boston, thinking I'm going to this great university, which was a great university. But I'd be right in Kenmore Square, and sort of people going to Red Sox games, like hurling racial epithets at me. It's the first time in my life I've been called the N-word, like in Boston, right?
Hmm.
I'm going up to the, what I consider to be this enlightened liberal city.
Right.
So I had that, I had friends tell me, I'm a baseball fan. I had never gone to Fenway Park as a student because I had friends who would say, people would throw beer on them from above, and, want to start fights with them. So you felt like you had to go with like 8 people to be safe. I went to a few Celtics games. I never met any of the figures you mentioned, but always those games, you'd always go like 5 or 6 people deep, just because you didn't win, because people would like just assault you in Boston, just over race. So So
Hmm.
I get what Perry Wallace was, talked about. It was a
Yeah.
very racially charged city, at least during my years as a college student.
Yep. And you mentioned like the reputation that what Boston might have as this liberal city. Meanwhile, Harry Edwards is in the Bay Area of California when he's receiving open your article with the death threats and the type of mail he was receiving back when he was leading the Olympic boycott efforts in '68. Sounds like you visited his archives when you were working on this story. What did you discover that he was dealing with at that time?
And I discovered that. I mean, he was dealing with raw racism in a place again that in my mind, thought even in the '60s would have been kind of, liberal place. I mean, we all know it's kind of the Bay Area is kind of the cradle of kind of counterculture and all of that. And I thought that would signal that there was some real liberalism there. And I'm sure there were pockets of that, but there was also stark racism that, Harry Edwards dealt with, both as a student athlete and later when he came back as a part-time instructor at the university at San Jose State College at the time, as it was called. Um, Dr. Edwards talks about black students and just walking down the street, going through Fraternity Row and being called all kinds of names. Again, racial epithets hurled at them in the '60s. Which, okay, it sounds like a long time ago now, but you think you're a little bit out of that realm. And again, this isn't Starksville, Mississippi. This isn't whatever. This isn't the Deep South. This isn't Macon, Georgia. This is San Jose, California, a place you think of as enlightened. So he faced that as an athlete. The athletes were faced with, sort of just treated like less than human. Basically most of the black students on campus were athletes at the time. Imagine a huge university like San Jose State College even then was a sizable university, but the black students generally were athletes and generally were just valued for their athletic talent. They weren't seen as sort of full human beings, certainly not as full students and all of that. And Dr. Edwards, he dealt with that. His history not just dealt with that, he triumphed over that. I mean, he really sort of flipped the script, as the kids said. He was a great athlete who ended up becoming a great intellectual. He actually sort of sidetracked his athletic career to pursue, you know, um, becoming this kind of thinker and this great sociologist that he became.
Hmm. And I mentioned at the outset he was kind of the inventor of sociology of sport. It sounds like he ran into a little bit of opposition that he even wanted to pursue that at Cornell. It's never been done before. Um, what did you learn about that experience and what were the influences that propelled him to wanting to study this? How did he convince people this was a worthy subject to study? Now we take it for granted. There's sports and society programs at universities and in many cities that you could say that the undefeated itself is a byproduct of what he started back in the 1960s. But I don't know that people understand the hurdles he had to overcome, even to legitimize this as a field of study.
I know and that's one of his, sort of great insights. He, just from being an athlete himself, he was a track athlete and a basketball player. He was actually a great discus thrower who was able to throw the discus throw without even knowing that much technique. And he's a big man, 6'8", I think at that time 240, kind of a power forward of the basketball team, coming up. So he was an athlete coming up and it's just something in him. He had this insight. It's hard to say exactly where it came from. It came from his experience somewhere, but it's hard to say what hooked him. But he just knew that sports was more than what most people then thought of it being. And you point out now that we take it for granted that sports and society. Of course, sports is it's sort of part of what goes on in our life. It's a big part of our culture and all of that. But then sports was really seen as being separate, like sports was totally an escape from kind of the travails of day-to-day life. You go, you cheer for your team. These guys are almost like gladiators. And there's a lot of that now, but then it was more so. And they just do what they do in the field, but they're not even full human beings. But Dr. Edwards, he just knew it. He just knew that, no, there's more than that. And as you point out, he gets to Cornell and he wants to pursue this for his PhD, for his thesis. And his advisory panel is like, man, what are you talking about? Like, that's not a thing. Like, sports in society is not a thing. And again, I don't know where he gets this kind of determination from, because I'm thinking, as he's telling me this, I wonder how I would have reacted to that if it were me, like going for a PhD. I probably would have thought, I guess I need a different topic, But he just knew that no, he had something there, and he talked him into it. And even then, the panel was very reluctant, and they said, "Hey, man, well, you're gonna get laughed out of the profession." And he says, "Well, we'll see." And lo and behold, he invents this field. And I didn't put it in the article, but he said that the head of the chair, I guess, of the little advisory panel, later came to him, years later, and said, "Yeah, I wish I'd known what you knew at the time." And that's another thing for Dr. Edwards. Like, he doesn't hold people as enemies, right? Like, when people disagree with him or even oppose him, he says, "Okay, I'm going to show you," right? But then
Uh,
he doesn't, as they say, no, he doesn't cancel you, or he doesn't look to cast you aside necessarily. He looks to convert you. And he said, probably maybe I should even put that in the story, because he, like, this chairman, he sort of mentioned that in a way, like, see, I turned him around. He said, I held firm, and I not only just held firm, but I did the work, right? And I demonstrated that that sports are indeed such a big part of what we as Americans sort of celebrate in our culture. It's like one of the few things, places where kind of all of us come together and
yeah.
have the ability to do that.
There was a paragraph in your story I wanted to read because it relates to what you just said. He said, through the years, Edward said he was careful to ensure that his activism be more than symbolic. He wanted it to force tangible change. That meant working with sports leagues, coaches, and team owners, the types of people who were once targets of his protests. And he ran into some critics of that approach that might have seen him as a sellout, for working with Roger Goodell or Al Campanis or teams and leagues. What was it about him that was I also think, just the way he dressed, right? Like, this is a tall guy. He always wears all black. He's got black shades on. He could be kind of stereotypical figure that would like scare white people, right? And yet he was always willing to work with these people too. You wrote in the piece that he would go see Malcolm X when he was at Cornell, right? He's leading a Black Power protest at Mexico City, but then you've got Roger Goodell quoted in the piece, like, really sad that he's at this state of health right now and is going to miss his good friend. It sounds like a person that's not easy to categorize, maybe, or stereotype the way some people might want to.
Oh, no, you're exactly right. And it's interesting. You talk about the way Harry dresses. He, like you point out, he wears all black. Like, during his kind of heyday, I think he used to even have like would have like a book of matches like pinned to his leather jacket and stuff like that. And he's written in his memoir that he was kind of convinced to do that because it was a way to sort of like get attention, right? And it's a way also to, like, I think, sort of like puncture myth and puncture stereotype too, because you see this guy, you think one thing, then you talk to him immediately, you get a whole nother impression, right? Like, whatever your impression was, he's a very reasonable, very thoughtful guy, right? Who presents this kind of, to what some people, you say white people, some black people thought he was menacing, and but it's almost like he almost uses that as leverage in a way, sort of like, you think that, but look here. And so he was able to convert a lot of people. He and Bill Walsh became great friends. When Bill Walsh was coaching the 49ers, for example, he and Peter Uberoff, when Uberoff was commissioner of baseball, were great friends. Uberoff was a fellow graduate of San Jose State, went to San Jose State before Dr. Edwards did, but still, he was kind of at least a friend, associated, whatever you want to call it, someone he worked with. And Peter Uberoff brought him in after, as you mentioned, Al Campanis, after the Al Campanis debacle, where Campanis famously said that blacks didn't have the necessities to be, think about this, be baseball managers. Like, that's like nuclear science,
Right.
but nonetheless, and again, Dr. Edwards had this remarkable ability. Like, he didn't just say, okay, that's a racist, SOB, Al Campanis. No, he actually worked with Al Campanis. And, I give a little anecdote in the piece where it was Campanis who Harry turned to when he first was asked by Uberoff to kind of straighten out the mess from his crazy quote. And Campanis in turn was so happy, first of all, just to sort of have a way back from this place of disgrace. And he secondly, he was the one who recommended that Dusty Baker, you know, was someone who thought it could be actually would be a really good manager. And lo and behold, Harry set it up so Baker could be hired by the Giants first as a coach, and then a couple of years later he was manager. And obviously that kicked off a storied career.
Mhm. Um, for those who haven't read the article, what is the state of his health right now?
Well, Dr. Edwards has several kinds of cancer. He has a virulent form of prostate cancer. He also has, I guess it's called a melanoma. It's like a bone marrow cancer that affects the production of our red blood cells in his body. If you see him, he sounds fine. He's moving a little slow. Says the cancer's caused some like sort of bouts of pain, stabbing pain. He described it as in his pelvis and hips and all of that. But that's kind of episodic. And so he looks fine, but his days are numbered. He doesn't put a number on them. I guess all our days are numbered, but maybe his more clearly so.
Hmm.
So he's fighting the cancer. He has periodic pain in his body, but he's sharp as ever. Like when I talked to him, we met over at the 49ers facility at Levi Stadium in Santa Clara. He held forth for 2.5 hours, like without. I mean, maybe he took 2 sips of water or something, but he
Yeah.
couldn't really. He seemed as robust and as strong as ever. If I didn't know he had cancer, I wouldn't know. He had his cane, he was moving around a little slow, but he also had wrenched his knee that day, something crazy, like how you take a bad step. Maybe you don't know that yet, Andrew, but it seems like I know about like taking a wrong step. You're thinking, damn, well, what
Yeah.
happened? So but by some measures, obviously he's terminally ill, but in another way, he still looks sharp and sounds sharp and can hold forth and sound strong. So who knows? I mean, hopefully he has a long way to go.
Yeah. And from the article, it sounds like he's at peace with whatever is to come with his health, but also sort of at peace. You wonder, like, if you talk to someone that's been around for a long time, like was part of civil rights movement, for example, or with Dr. Edwards, with so many battles that he's fought, and then you think about the state of the world right now, and you wonder, like, do these people think that what they did, like, what did it amount to? Like, if we're back at a certain spot right now, but it also seemed like he was at peace with kind of a perpetual need for a struggle, that there's always going to be people that come and fill a void, whether you can really identify them right now or not. Like, what was the sense you got from him as he reflects on his life and where things are today?
It's funny you put your finger on kind of like one of the tension points between me and the editors on the story, as a matter of fact, because going into the story, part of the notion was that we're in this moment now where many people, feel like the country is, sort of retreating from these civil rights gains, from diversity gains, all these things that Dr. Edwards sort of stood at the forefront, these battles he stood at the forefront of for years and years, decades and decades. So there was some feeling that, well, Dr. Edwards is going to weigh in as, oh God, all is lost, or, gosh, I can't believe the country is in this state. But he was interestingly at peace with kind of where we are. He says, there's nothing but struggle. Like any game, you're going to take 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and struggle's the only kind of constant. You always have to struggle. There are going to be people who rise up, and you don't know, you can't predict who they're going to be. Who would have, as he says, who would have predicted that Dr. King would become Dr. King when he was a 26-year-old minister in Montgomery, sort of dealing with the segregated bus situation there, leading the bus boycott. Who knew how that would go, and who knew that would launch the career that we knew Dr. King had, as short as it was. So he's interesting. I mean, and I kept trying to push him on this point. So, well, but is this different? Is this? And he's like, no, and he goes back through the history of sports activism. Long before him, he is, I think, a figure who's brought this into kind of a place where it'll never be out of focus again. But there were activists who weren't seen as activists back in the day, going back to the 19th century. People who had black baseball teams that tried to get into the forerunners of the major leagues. Track athletes who protested because Jim Crow was just too much to tolerate. He talks about Wilma Rudolph doing, sort of refusing to go to a parade held in our honor after our great
Hmm.
performance in the Olympics unless the parade was desegregated. And so they gave in on that, but they wouldn't desegregate a banquet that followed. And she refused to go, and she paid a price. All these people pay a price for that, but that's part of the struggle that he thinks is going to be perpetual.
Well, your article is called Harry Edwards Isn't Done Just Yet. People can read it on ESPN.com. It was a terrific article. Um, Michael, thank you for joining us. The last question, like, assume you live in the East Coast, right? You fly out to California to interview Dr. Edwards. Like when you're on the plane ride back, having had that experience with him, like just what did it feel like? What was going through your mind about the article you had to write, but also just as a person having spent this time with a historic figure such as
Oh,
Dr. Edwards?
it's for you know enough about this journalism thing. You meet a lot of people, right? And and often you meet people who you admire from afar, but when you meet them, maybe they don't, they don't shine as brightly as they did from afar. But with Dr. Edwards, it was almost the opposite. It was such he made just a real impression on me. His sort of his optimism in some ways, his determination, his strength that he's able to convey. It was almost like a reminder of hey, do your little part. You know what I mean? Like, what are you scared of? But, I felt sort of I don't know, sort of pumped up by by having met him and talked to him and having spoken with him for that length of time. So, he was one of those kind of famous people you meet who lived up to more even surpassed what I kind of thought he was.
Yeah, oh, that's great. Well, again, thank you for taking the time. I'm really honored to have a chance to talk to you. Hopefully, have a chance to meet in person sometime in DC, or if you're ever down in Nashville, let us know. We'll have you come speak to our athletes or to students here at Vandy.
I'll be happy to do it. Good to meet you, Andrew.